Welcome to your personalized deep dive. Today we're cracking open this world of adversary emulation, and we're going to be guided by the book Adversary Emulation with MITRE AT&CK. You've probably heard about data breaches, cyber attacks all over the news these days, but we're going to go a little bit deeper beyond just the headlines. Imagine you could get a sneak peek into the actual playbook of cyber adversaries. That's what adversary emulation is all about. It's basically understanding how attackers think and act so we can build defenses that really work.
Yeah, it's almost like a flight simulator for cybersecurity professionals.
Oh, okay.
We're not just running those, generic vulnerability scans here. We're actually simulating real-world attack scenarios, and they're based on these tactics, techniques, and procedures of known threat actors, and it's all done in a safe, controlled environment.
So it's not just about finding weaknesses, but like experiencing how they would exploit them.
Exactly. And it's become even more crucial now because cyber threats are constantly evolving.
Right.
Think about it. Traditional security assessments often focus on individual vulnerabilities. But a skilled attacker won't just exploit a single vulnerability, right? They're going to chain together a series of actions, moving laterally within the network, escalating privileges, and ultimately achieving their objective.
Right.
Adversary emulation helps us understand and defend against these complex attack paths.
Okay. I'm starting to see why this is so important. But how do we even know what kind of attacks to simulate? It's not like attackers publish their playbooks online, do they?
That's where cyber threat intelligence comes in, or CTI. It's the process of gathering and analyzing information about cyber threats from a variety of sources.
Okay.
These could be things like security vendors, open source intelligence reports, and even some dark web forums.
Wow.
By studying past attacks, we can identify patterns, predict future trends, and even build profiles of specific threat actors.
So we're essentially using their past behavior to predict their future moves.
Exactly. And to make sense of all this information, we use the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's like this massive encyclopedia of adversary tactics and techniques, and it's meticulously documented and categorized. It's kind of like having a universal language for describing cyber attacks, which makes it incredibly valuable for both attackers and defenders.
This MITRE ATT&CK framework, I've heard the name before, but could you break it down a little bit further for me?
Sure, yeah. Imagine a massive library, but instead of books, it's filled with every imaginable tactic and technique a cyber attacker could use. And it's organized in a way that allows you to see the big picture of an attack broken down into different stages.
Okay.
Like initial access, persistence, privilege escalation, and so on. Each of these stages has a list of specific techniques that attackers might use. For example, under initial access, you might have techniques like spear phishing, exploiting a vulnerable web application, or even compromising a third-party vendor.
So instead of just saying, oh, we were hacked, we can now say we were hacked using this specific technique.
Exactly. This level of granularity is crucial for understanding how attackers operate and for developing effective defenses. But it's not just about the technical details. The IMP ATT&CK framework also helps us understand the psychology of cyber attackers.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. We're not just talking about lines of code here. We're talking about the human element of cybercrime.
Precisely. By studying the tactics and techniques associated with different threat actors, we can start to understand their motivations, their goals, their level of sophistication, and even their risk tolerance. And this insight is crucial for building realistic adversary emulations.
Can you give an example of how understanding an attacker's psychology might actually inform the emulation process?
Yeah, let's take the example of a financially motivated attacker like FIN6. We know they're after money, specifically payment card data.
Right.
So in our emulation, we wouldn't just simulate any random attack. We'd focus on techniques. FIN6 is known to use spear phishing employees to steal credentials, exploiting vulnerabilities in point-of-sale systems, and exfiltrating data in ways that avoid detection.
So instead of just testing if our defenses can detect, generic malware, we're specifically testing if they can detect the kind that FIN6 would use and deployed in the way they would use it.
Exactly. And this level of specificity makes the emulation much more valuable. We're not just testing for theoretical vulnerabilities. We're testing our ability to defend against a real-world threat.
Okay, this is fascinating. So we've gathered intelligence, we've mapped out the tactics and techniques using the MITRE framework, we've even started to profile the psychology of our adversary. But how do we actually turn all of this into a tangible emulation plan?
Well, first we need to define the scope of the engagement, right? Are we emulating a specific attack campaign like the one FIN6 used against a particular company? Or are we testing our overall defenses against a broader range of techniques?
Right.
This will depend on the organization's specific needs and risk tolerance.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yeah.
Each adversary emulation is tailored.
Exactly. We also need to identify the specific threat actor we want to emulate. This could be a group like FIN6 or APT29, or it could be a more generic profile based on the industry or the geographical location of the organization.
I see. So we're essentially creating a custom-made attack scenario based on the most likely threats the organization might face.
Precisely. And once we have our target attacker in mind, we need to develop a DTTP outline. This is essentially the playbook for our emulation, outlining each step of the attack we want to simulate.
So it's like a script for our simulated attackers to follow.
Exactly, but it's not just a random list of techniques. The TTP outline should be carefully crafted based on real-world intelligence about the chosen threat actor.
Yeah.
For example, if we're emulating APT41, a Chinese state-sponsored group, we might include techniques like spearphishing executives with targeted emails, exploiting vulnerabilities in VPN software to gain initial access, and then using custom malware to steal sensitive data and maintain persistent access.
So we're essentially reverse engineering a real attack, using their own playbook against them.
Exactly. And by doing this, we can identify weaknesses in the organization's defenses that they might not even know they had. But it's not just about finding those technical vulnerabilities. Adversary emulation also helps us uncover weaknesses in processes and even human behavior.
Okay, let's dig into that a bit more. How can adversary emulation reveal weaknesses that go beyond just technology?
Think about it. Even the most sophisticated security technology can be bypassed if an employee falls for a well-crafted phishing email, right?
Right.
Or if there's a gap in the incident response process. Adversary emulation allows us to test these human and procedural elements in a safe environment.
Okay.
For instance, we might send simulated phishing emails to employees as part of the emulation to see how they respond.
Oh, interesting.
Do they recognize the signs of a phishing attempt? Do they report it to the security team? Or do they click on the malicious link, giving our simulated attacker a foothold in the network?
That's a great point. So we're not just testing firewalls and antivirus software here. We're testing their awareness, their training.
Exactly. And this holistic approach is what makes adversary emulation so valuable. It goes beyond simple vulnerability assessments and provides a much more realistic and comprehensive view of the organization's security posture. But before we can actually launch our simulated attack, we need to address a few more crucial steps in the planning process.
This all sounds incredibly complex. I could only imagine the resources required to pull off these kinds of emulations.
You're right. Adversary emulation does require a significant investment, not just in terms of the technology, but also the expertise.
Yeah.
We need skilled professionals who understand the intricacies of cyber attacks, who can think like the adversary, who can adapt and improvise as the emulation unfolds.
It sounds like we need a whole team of ethical hackers ready to unleash their skills on an unsuspecting organization.
Well, not quite unsuspecting. Ethical considerations are paramount in adversary emulation.
Of course, yeah.
We always operate with the organization's full consent and within clearly defined rules of engagement.
So it's like a friendly sparring match,
Yeah,
where both sides know the rules and the ultimate goal is to improve everybody's skills.
exactly. We work closely with the organization to define the scope of the engagement, the systems that are off limits, the types of attacks that are permissible, and the data that should be handled with extra care.
So we're not just cowboys hacking away at random targets. There's a lot of careful planning and coordination involved to ensure everything is done ethically.
Absolutely, yeah. We also need to be mindful of the financial aspects, right?
Right.
Adversary emulation can be a resource-intensive process involving specialized tools, infrastructure, and personnel. We need to ensure that the organization understands the costs involved and that the benefits of the emulation outweigh the investment.
I can see how that would be a tough sell for some organizations. Hey, let's pay a bunch of ethical hackers to break into our systems. But I guess the long-term cost of a real breach outweighs the cost of a controlled emulation.
Exactly. And that's a conversation we need to have upfront. We need to articulate the value proposition of adversary emulation, explain how it can help the organization improve their security posture, and demonstrate how it aligns with their overall business objectives.
Okay, so we've defined the scope, we've identified our target attacker, we've developed our TTP outline, addressed the ethical and financial considerations. What's next in the planning process?
Before we can launch our simulated attack, we need to, set the stage, so to speak. And that involves setting up a dedicated lab environment.
A lab environment. You mean like a virtual playground where our ethical hackers can unleash their attacks without causing any real damage?
Exactly. This lab environment allows us to create a safe and controlled space where we can experiment, test our TTPs, and observe the organization's defenses in action. It could be a physical or a virtual environment, depending on the complexity of the emulation and the resources available.
So we're essentially building a miniature replica of their network, but in a sandboxed environment where we can kind of play around without real-world consequences.
Precisely. The key is to make this lab environment as realistic as possible. We want to mimic the organization's network architecture, their systems, their applications, their data, even their security controls.
So it's like a movie set where everything looks real, but it's all just a facade.
That's a great analogy. And just like a movie set, we can control the environment, introduce specific variables, and observe how in this case, the organization's defenses respond.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture. We've built our virtual battleground, we've got our ethical hackers ready to go, and we're eagerly awaiting the launch of our simulated attack. But before we unleash the digital hounds, what kind of tools and technologies are we using to orchestrate all of this? Are we talking about custom-built hacking tools, or are there off-the-shelf solutions available?
There's a fascinating ecosystem of tools available for adversary emulation, ranging from open-source utilities to sophisticated commercial platforms. And the choice of tools often depends on the complexity of the emulation and the specific objectives we're trying to achieve.
Can you give me some examples of these tools? What are the heavy hitters in the adversary emulation world?
Two popular platforms that are often used in adversary emulation are Caldera and Atomic Red Team. Caldera is an automated adversary emulation platform that's incredibly versatile. It allows us to create these realistic attack scenarios, automate the execution of TTPs, and observe the results in real time. It's like having a virtual hacker at our fingertips.
So we can basically program Caldera to behave like a specific threat actor, using their known TTPs and attack patterns.
Exactly. And it's not just about replicating their actions, it's about understanding their motivations and goals.
Right.
Caldera allows us to chain together different attack techniques, simulate decision-making processes, and even introduce elements of randomness to make the emulation more realistic.
That's fascinating. It's like we're creating a digital doppelganger of the attacker, complete with their own unique style and personality.
Exactly. And this level of realism is crucial for testing the organization's defenses effectively. We don't want to just throw generic attacks at them. We want to simulate the specific tactics and techniques that a real attacker would use.
Okay, so Caldera is like the Swiss Army knife of adversary emulation. What about Atomic Red Team? How does it fit into the picture?
Atomic Red Team is more focused on testing specific defenses against individual attack techniques. Imagine you have a security control in place, like an intrusion detection system, and you want to see how well it detects a particular attack technique, like pass the hash.
Okay.
Atomic Red Team provides a library of small atomic tests that you can execute to validate your defenses.
So it's like a unit test for security controls.
Exactly. Each test is well documented, easy to execute, and provides clear results. This makes it ideal for training security teams, validating detection rules, and identifying gaps in defenses.
So Caldera is more for comprehensive emulation of complex attack scenarios, while Atomic Red Team is more focused on targeted testing of specific defenses.
You got it. And they can actually complement each other quite well.
Oh, okay.
We might use Caldera to run a full-blown adversary emulation exercise, and then use Atomic Red Team to drill down into specific areas where we observed weaknesses. But it's important to remember that tools are just one piece of the puzzle. The real magic of adversary emulation lies in the human element, the expertise of the team executing the emulation, and their ability to think like the attacker.
That's a great point. It's not just about having the right tools, it's about having the right mindset. So let's talk about that human element a bit more. How do we actually go about emulating the mindset of a cyber attacker? Is there some secret formula for getting inside their heads?
Well, there's no magic formula, but there are certain approaches we can take to better understand the psychology of our adversaries. And it all starts with research. We need to delve deep into the world of cybercrime, studying past attacks, reading intelligence reports, and even exploring dark web forums where attackers congregate.
So it's like doing field work, But instead of trekking through jungles, we're navigating the murky depths of the internet.
Exactly. And through this research, we can start to build profiles of different threat actors. We can understand their motivations, their goals, their level of sophistication, their risk tolerance, and even their preferred tactics and techniques.
So it's like building a criminal profile, but for a cyber adversary instead of a human criminal.
You got it. And once we have this profile, we can start to think like the attacker.
Okay.
We can ask ourselves questions like, if I were this attacker, what would my objectives be? How would I approach this target? What tools and techniques would I use? What obstacles would I anticipate? How would I try to evade detection?
So it's like a game of mental chess, trying to anticipate their moves and counter them before they even make them.
Exactly, and this mindset is crucial for creating realistic and effective adversary emulations. We need to go beyond simply replicating their technical actions. We need to understand their motivations, their thought processes, and their overall strategy.
Okay. So we've done our research, we've built our attacker profiles, and we've started to think like the enemy. But how do we actually translate all of this into a tangible emulation plan? Where do we even begin?
Well, the first step is to choose a specific adversary to emulate. This could be a group like FI&CK, known for their focus on financial gain, or a group like ATT&CK, believed to be associated with Russian intelligence and known for their stealth and persistence.
Okay, so we've picked our adversary. What's next?
Next, we need to define the scope of our emulation. What are we trying to achieve?
Right.
Are we testing specific security controls, or are we evaluating the organization's overall security posture? This will determine the TTPs we choose to emulate and the depth of our attack simulation.
So we're not just blindly throwing attacks at the wall and seeing what sticks. We have a clear objective in mind, and we're choosing TTPs that align with that objective.
Exactly. And once we have our TTPs selected, we need to develop a detailed attack scenario. This is like a storyboard for our emulation, outlining each step of the attack from initial access to the exfiltration of data.
So it's like a script for a movie, but instead of actors, we have ethical hackers and security controls.
Exactly. And just like a good movie script, our attack scenario should have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Okay.
It should be engaging, suspenseful, and ultimately informative.
I love the way you're framing this. It makes adversary emulation sound more like an art form than a technical exercise.
Well, there's definitely an element of creativity involved, but it's important to remember that we're not just trying to entertain ourselves here. The goal of adversary emulation is to identify and remediate vulnerabilities, to help organizations improve their security posture, and ultimately to make the digital world a safer place.
Okay, so we've chosen our adversary, defined our scope, selected our TTPs, and developed a detailed attack scenario. What's next? Are we ready to launch our simulated attack?
Almost. We're getting close, but before we unleash our ethical hackers, we need to make sure we have the right tools and infrastructure in place to support our emulation.
Okay, so we're talking about things like virtual machines, network simulators, security tools, and of course the skilled professionals who will be executing the emulation.
Exactly. We need to ensure that we have a robust lab environment that can accurately replicate the organization's network and systems. And we need a team of experienced ethical hackers who understand the intricacies of cyber attacks and can think like the adversary.
So it's like assembling a crack team of digital specialists, each with their own unique skills and expertise.
Precisely. And just like any good team, we need to have clear communication, coordination, and a shared understanding of the mission objectives.
This all sounds incredibly exciting. It's like we're preparing for a major military operation, but instead of tanks and soldiers, we have virtual machines and ethical hackers.
That's a great analogy. And just like a military operation, adversary emulation requires careful planning, execution, and debriefing to ensure that we achieve our objectives and learn from the experience.
Okay, so we've assembled our team, we've set up our lab environment, we've fine-tuned our attack scenario, and we're finally ready to launch our simulated attack. I can't wait to see how this all plays out.
I'm excited too. The execution phase is where we put our plan into action and see how the organization's defenses hold up against a real-world threat. But it's important to remember that adversary emulation is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process.
Okay.
We'll need to monitor the organization's response, analyze the results, and provide recommendations for improvement.
So it's like a continuous feedback loop where we're constantly testing, learning, and adapting our approach.
Exactly. Adversary emulation is not about finding a single silver bullet solution. It's about building a culture of continuous improvement and proactive security.
This has been an incredible deep dive so far. I'm already starting to see the world of cybersecurity in a whole new light.
I'm glad to hear that. And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in the world of adversary emulation. But for now, let's take a closer look at some specific adversary groups and see how their tactics, techniques, and procedures can be used to create truly realistic and challenging emulations.
I'm all ears. Let's start with one of the groups you mentioned earlier, FIN6. What makes them so unique? And how can we emulate their approach effectively?
FIN6 is a fascinating adversary to emulate because they're incredibly skilled, highly motivated, but their motivations are purely financial. They're not interested in disrupting operations or making political statements. They're after one thing, money. And they're very good at getting it.
So they're like the professional bank robbers of the cyber world. Efficient, targeted, and focused on maximizing their profits.
Exactly, and that laser focus on financial gain shapes their entire approach to cyber attacks. They choose their targets carefully, selecting organizations that process large volumes of payment card data. They use a combination of technical skills and social engineering to compromise systems, often targeting employees with spear phishing emails or exploiting vulnerabilities in point-of-sale systems. And they're masters of stealth, moving laterally within networks, escalating privileges, and exfiltrating data without raising any alarms.
So they're not the smash and grab type of attackers. They're more like patient burglars, carefully casing the joint, disabling the alarms, and making off with the loot before anyone even notices they were there.
Precisely. And that's what makes them such a challenging adversary to emulate. We need to replicate their patience, their precision, and their ability to blend in with legitimate network traffic. But before we get into the specifics of emulating FIN6, let's take a step back and look at the broader landscape of adversary emulation. There are a few key concepts that are important to understand before we dive into specific threat actors and their techniques.
Okay, I'm ready for a deeper dive. What are some of those fundamental concepts that we need to kind of wrap our heads around?
One of the most important concepts in adversary emulation is the idea of TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures. We've touched on this briefly before, but it's worth revisiting in more detail.
Absolutely. TTPs seem to be like the foundation of adversary emulation, so let's unpack that a bit further.
Think of TTPs as the building blocks of a cyber attack. Tactics represent the attacker's high-level goals, like gaining initial access to a network, escalating privileges, or exfiltrating data. Techniques are the specific methods used to achieve those goals, such as spear phishing, exploiting a vulnerability, or using a particular type of malware. And procedures are the detailed steps involved in executing those techniques.
So it's like a hierarchy, with tactics at the top, techniques in the middle, and procedures at the bottom.
Exactly. And understanding this hierarchy is crucial for both attackers and defenders. Attackers use TTPs to plan and execute their attacks, while defenders use them to analyze past attacks, predict future threats, and develop effective defenses.
This makes perfect sense. It's like a common language that both sides use to understand the game of cyber warfare.
Precisely. And one of the most valuable resources for understanding TTPs is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which we discussed earlier. This framework provides a comprehensive knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques organized in a way that makes it easy to understand and apply to real-world scenarios.
Okay, so we have this incredible framework that breaks down attacks into their constituent parts. But how do we actually use it in the context of adversary emulation?
Well, the first step is to choose the specific TTPs we want to emulate. This will depend on the adversary we're targeting, the scope of our emulation, and the organization's specific security concerns.
Okay.
For example, if we're emulating FIN6, we might focus on TTPs related to spear phishing, exploiting point-of-sale systems, and exfiltrating data stealthily.
So we're essentially cherry-picking the TTPs that are most relevant to our emulation objectives.
Exactly. And once we have our TTPs selected, we need to map them to specific techniques and procedures.
Okay.
For example, if we're emulating a spear phishing attack, we might choose to use a technique called malicious attachment delivery, where we send an email with a malicious document attached. And then we'd need to develop specific procedures for crafting that document, choosing the right payload, and evading email security filters.
This all sounds incredibly detailed and complex. It's like we're reverse engineering a real attack step by step.
It is a meticulous process, but that's what makes adversary emulation so effective. We're not just throwing random attacks at the wall and seeing what sticks. We're carefully crafting our emulations based on real-world intelligence and best practices, ensuring that they're both realistic and challenging.
Okay, so we've selected our TTPs, mapped them to specific techniques and procedures, and developed a detailed plan for our emulation. What's next? Are we finally ready to launch our simulated attack?
Almost. But before we unleash our ethical hackers, we need to take a step back and consider the ethical implications of what we're doing.
That's an important point. We're essentially talking about breaking into an organization's systems, even if it's just a simulated attack. There are definitely some ethical considerations we need to address.
Absolutely. Adversary emulation is a powerful tool, but it's also a potentially dangerous one if not used responsibly.
Right.
We need to ensure that we're operating within clearly defined rules of engagement, that we have the organization's full consent, and that we're not putting their systems or data at risk.
So it's like a surgeon performing a delicate operation. We need to be precise, careful, and always mindful of the patient's well-being.
Exactly. And just like a surgeon, we need to have a plan for dealing with unexpected complications.
Right.
What happens if our emulation triggers a false positive alert? What happens if we accidentally discover a real vulnerability? What happens if our attack simulation goes off the rails and starts impacting production systems?
These are all critical questions that need to be answered before we even think about launching our simulated attack.
Absolutely. We need to have a clear communication plan in place with designated points of contact on both sides. We need to establish escalation procedures for dealing with unexpected events. And we need to have a plan for remediating any vulnerabilities that we discover during the emulation.
So it's not just about launching the attack and seeing what happens. There's a lot of careful planning and preparation involved to ensure that everything is done ethically and responsibly.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to work with experienced professionals who understand the nuances of adversary emulation and who can navigate these ethical considerations with care and sensitivity. We need to ensure that we're operating within clearly defined rules of engagement, that we have the organization's full consent, and that we're not putting their systems or data at risk.
So it's like a surgeon performing a delicate operation. We need to be precise, careful, and always mindful of the patient's well-being.
Exactly. And just like a surgeon, we need to have a plan for dealing with unexpected complications. What happens if our emulation triggers a false positive alert? What happens if we accidentally discover a real vulnerability? What happens if our attack simulation goes off the rails and starts impacting production systems?
These are all critical questions that need to be answered before we even think about launching our simulated attack.
Absolutely. We need to have a clear communication plan in place with designated points of contact on both sides. We need to establish escalation procedures for dealing with unexpected events, and we need to have a plan for remediating any vulnerabilities that we discover during the emulation.
So it's not just about launching the attack and seeing what happens. There's a lot of careful planning and preparation involved to ensure that everything is done ethically and responsibly.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to work with experienced professionals who understand the nuances of adversary emulation and who can navigate these ethical considerations with care and sensitivity.
Okay, so we've addressed the ethical considerations, we have our plan in place, and we're finally ready to unleash our ethical hackers on the unsuspecting organization. I can't wait to see how this all plays out.
I'm excited too. The execution phase is where we put our plan into action and see how the organization's defenses hold up against a real-world threat. But before we dive into the specifics of executing an adversary emulation, let's take a moment to discuss the importance of choosing the right tools for the job.
Okay, so we're talking about the digital arsenal that our ethical hackers will be using to penetrate the organization's defenses.
Exactly. And just like a real-world military operation, the success of our mission depends on having the right tools for the job. We need to carefully consider the adversary we're emulating, the scope of our engagement, and the organization's specific security environment.
So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to tool selection.
Not at all. The tools we choose will vary depending on the specific goals and constraints of each emulation. For example, if we're emulating a sophisticated nation-state attacker like APT-29, we might need to use advanced tools that can bypass traditional security controls and mimic their stealthy tactics.
So it's about matching the tools to the adversary's capabilities.
Exactly. We also need to consider the organization's existing security infrastructure. If they have a robust security information and event management SIEM system in place, we'll need tools that can generate events that will be picked up by that system. Otherwise, our emulation might go undetected, which wouldn't be very helpful for assessing their defenses.
So we need to make sure that our tools are compatible with the organization's security monitoring capabilities.
Absolutely. And we also need to consider the expertise of our team. Some tools require specialized knowledge and skills to operate effectively. We wouldn't want to choose a tool that's too complex for our team to handle or one that doesn't align with their expertise.
This makes perfect sense. It's all about finding the right balance between capability, compatibility, and expertise. But with so many tools available, How do we even know where to start? What are some of the key categories of adversary emulation tools that we should be aware of?
Well, one way to categorize these tools is by their functionality. Some tools are designed for specific tasks like reconnaissance exploitation or post-exploitation. Others are more comprehensive, providing a suite of capabilities for planning, executing, and analyzing adversary emulations.
Can you give me some examples of these different types of tools?
Sure, for reconnaissance, we might use tools like Nmap or Shodan to scan networks and identify potential targets. For exploitation, we might use tools like Metasploit or Cobalt Strike to exploit vulnerabilities and gain access to systems. And for post-exploitation, we might use tools like Mimikatz or PowerShell Empire to move laterally within the network, escalate privileges, and exfiltrate data.
So we're essentially building a virtual toolbox, with each tool serving a specific purpose in our adversary emulation arsenal.
Exactly. And just like a real-world toolbox, it's important to have a variety of tools at our disposal so we can choose the right one for each task.
Okay, so we have our reconnaissance tools, our exploitation tools, and our post-exploitation tools. What about tools for planning and analyzing our emulations?
That's where platforms like Caldera and ATT&CK come in. These platforms provide a comprehensive suite of capabilities for planning, executing, and analyzing adversary emulations. They allow us to create detailed attack scenarios, automate the execution of TTPs, and generate reports that provide actionable insights into the organization's security posture.
So these platforms are like the command centers for our adversary emulations.
Exactly. They allow us to manage the entire process from start to finish, ensuring that our emulations are realistic, effective, and aligned with the organization's specific goals.
This is fascinating stuff. I'm starting to see how adversary emulation can be used to proactively identify and remediate weaknesses rather than waiting for a real attack to happen and then reacting.
Exactly. And that's the whole point of adversary emulation, to shift from a reactive security posture to a proactive one. By understanding how attackers operate, we can anticipate their moves, strengthen our defenses, and ultimately make ourselves a less attractive target.
Okay, so we've chosen our adversary, defined our scope, selected our TTPs, developed a detailed plan for our emulation, addressed the ethical considerations, assembled our team, set up our lab environment, and even chosen our tools. Are we finally ready to launch our simulated attack?
We're almost there. But before we unleash our ethical hackers, there's one more crucial step we need to take: reconnaissance.
Reconnaissance? You mean like gathering intelligence on the target before we attack?
Exactly. In the world of cyber warfare, knowledge is power. The more we know about our target, the more effective our emulation will be.
So it's not just about blindly throwing attacks at the wall and seeing what sticks. We need to do our homework first and understand the lay of the land.
Precisely. Reconnaissance is all about gathering information that will help us plan and execute our emulation more effectively. We need to understand the organization's network architecture, their systems, their applications, their data, and their security controls.
Okay, so what kind of information are we looking for during reconnaissance, and how do we go about gathering it?
Well, there are two main types of reconnaissance: passive and active. Passive reconnaissance involves gathering information without directly interacting with the target's systems. This could include things like searching for information on the internet, reviewing public records, or monitoring social media.
So it's like being a digital detective, piecing together clues from publicly available sources.
Exactly. And passive reconnaissance can be surprisingly effective. You'd be amazed at the amount of information that organizations inadvertently expose online.
I can imagine. What about active reconnaissance? How does that differ from passive reconnaissance?
Active reconnaissance involves directly interacting with the target systems, but in a way that's unlikely to trigger alarms or raise suspicion. This could include things like port scanning, vulnerability scanning, or even sending carefully crafted emails to employees.
So it's like testing the waters, seeing how the target responds to our probes without revealing our true intentions.
Exactly. And active reconnaissance can be very valuable for gathering detailed information about the target's network and security posture.
Okay, so we've gathered our intelligence, we've identified potential targets, and we've mapped out the organization's defenses. What's next? Are we finally ready to launch our simulated attack?
We're getting close.
Yeah.
But before we unleash our ethical hackers, we need to make sure we have a clear understanding of the rules of engagement.
The rules of engagement, you mean like a set of guidelines that govern our actions during the emulation?
Exactly. The rules of engagement are crucial for ensuring that our emulation is ethical, responsible, and aligned with the organization's expectations.
So it's like a contract between us and the organization outlining what we can and cannot do during the emulation.
Precisely. The rules of engagement should cover things like the scope of the engagement, what systems are in scope, what data is off limits, the permissible attack techniques. Are we allowed to use social engineering? Are there any specific exploits that are prohibited? The communication plan.
Where are?
The communication plan. Who are our points of contact? How often will we provide updates? And what are the escalation procedures in case something unexpected happens?
So it's like a safety net, making sure everyone's on the same page and we can quickly address any issues that might arise.
Exactly. We also need to define the criteria for success.
Yeah.
What does a successful adversary emulation look like? Is it about achieving a specific objective like exfiltrating sensitive data? Or is it about identifying and exploiting a certain number of vulnerabilities?
So we're not just playing a game capture the flag, we're setting clear goals and metrics that align with the organization's security objectives.
Precisely. And once we have our rules of engagement in place, we're finally ready to launch our simulated attack.
Okay, the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's unleash the ethical hackers. But how do we actually go about executing an adversary emulation? What are the key steps involved?
Well, the execution phase can vary depending on the adversary we're emulating, the scope of the engagement, and the organization's specific environment. But there are some general steps that are common to most adversary emulations.
Can you walk me through those steps? What does a typical adversary emulation look like in action?
The first step is to gain initial access to the target network. This could involve exploiting a vulnerable web application, sending a spear phishing email with a malicious attachment, or even compromising a third-party vendor.
So it's all about getting a foothold, creating a beachhead from which we can launch further attacks.
Exactly. And once we have that initial foothold, we need to maintain our access and evade detection. This is where techniques like persistence defense evasion and command and control come into play.
Okay, let's unpack some of those terms, starting with persistence. What does that mean in the context of adversary emulation?
Persistence is all about ensuring that we can maintain our access to the target network, even if our initial point of entry is discovered and blocked. Imagine we exploit a vulnerability to gain access to a server, but the organization's security team patches that vulnerability the next day. If we haven't established persistence, we're locked out.
So it's like planting a backdoor, creating a hidden entrance that we can use to slip back in, even if the front door is bolted shut.
Exactly. And there are many different techniques for establishing persistence, from creating rogue user accounts to modifying system files to installing malicious software that runs in the background.
Okay, that makes sense. What about defense evasion? How do we avoid tripping the organization's security alarms during our simulated attack?
Defense evasion is all about blending in with a legitimate traffic, making our malicious activity appear as normal as possible. We might use encryption to hide our communications, obfuscate our code to make it harder to analyze, or even hijack legitimate system processes to disguise our actions.
So it's like wearing a camouflage suit, making ourselves invisible to the organization's security cameras.
That's a great analogy. And defense evasion is crucial for any successful adversary emulation. If we're constantly triggering alerts, the organization's security team will quickly identify and block us, which defeats the purpose of the exercise.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of these pieces fit together, but what about command and control? What does that mean in the context of adversary emulation?
Command and control, or C2, is how we communicate with our compromised systems once we've gained access. We need a way to send commands, receive data, and control the flow of our attack.
So it's like having a remote control for our compromised systems, allowing us to direct their actions from afar.
Exactly. And just like the defense evasion, C2 is all about stealth. We want to use communication channels and techniques that blend in with normal network traffic, making it harder for the organization's security tools to detect our presence.
This all sounds incredibly complex and technical. It's like we're playing a high-stakes game of digital chess, trying to outmaneuver the organization's defenses at every turn.
It's definitely a challenging endeavor, but that's what makes adversary emulation so rewarding. It allows us to test our skills, learn from our mistakes, and ultimately improve our ability to defend against real-world threats.
Okay, so we've gained initial access, maintained our persistence, evaded detection, and established our command and control. What's next in our simulated attack?
The next step depends on our objectives. If we're emulating FIN6, our goal might be to steal payment card data. So we might start by moving laterally within the network, trying to identify systems that process or store sensitive information.
So it's like a treasure hunt, but instead of gold, we're after credit card numbers.
Exactly. And once we've identified our target systems, we need to escalate our privileges. This means gaining administrative access to those systems so we can control them completely.
So it's like going from a guest account to the administrator account, giving us full control over the system.
Precisely. And once we have administrative privileges, we can do pretty much anything we want. We can install malware, access sensitive data, or even disable security controls.
This is starting to sound a bit scary. It's a good thing this is just a simulation.
That's right. It's important to remember that we're doing all of this in a safe and controlled environment with the organization's full consent. The goal is to identify weaknesses, not to cause any real harm.
Okay, so we've escalated our privileges and we have full control over the target systems. What's next? Do we just start grabbing credit card members and calling it a day?
Not quite. We still need to exfiltrate the data. That means getting it out of the organization's network and into our hands.
So it's like sneaking the loot out of the museum without getting caught by the guards.
Exactly. And just like defense evasion and C2 exfiltration is all about stealth. We want to use techniques that blend in with normal network traffic, making it difficult for the organization's security tools to detect our data theft.
Can you give me some examples of these stealthy exfiltration techniques? How do we get the data out without raising any red flags?
One common technique is to use DNS tunneling. This involves encoding the stolen data within DNS requests, which are typically used to resolve domain names to IP addresses. These requests often blend in with normal network traffic, making it challenging for security tools to identify them as malicious.
So it's like hiding a secret message in plain sight using a language that only the attacker and their server understand.
That's a great analogy. Another technique is to use steganography. This involves hiding data within image files or other types of media. For example, we could slightly alter the pixels in an image to encode stolen credit card numbers. To the human eye, the image would look completely normal, but our server would be able to extract the hidden data.
That's amazing. Like something out of a spy movie.
And these are just a few examples. There are many other exfiltration techniques that attackers use, and we need to be familiar with them all if we want to create realistic and challenging adversary emulations.
Okay, so we've successfully exfiltrated the data. Our simulated attack is complete. What happens next? Do we just pack up our virtual bags and go home?
Not quite. The execution phase is just one part of the adversary emulation process. We still need to analyze the results, document our findings, and provide recommendations for improvement.
So it's like a post-mortem where we dissect the attack, identify what went well, what went wrong, and what lessons we can learn.
Exactly. The post-emulation analysis is crucial for maximizing the value of the exercise. We need to understand how the organization's defenses performed, where the gaps are, and what steps they can take to improve their security posture.
Okay, so what are the key steps involved in this post-emulation analysis? How do we make sense of all the data we've gathered?
The first step is to review the logs and alerts generated by the organization's security tools. This will give us a timeline of the attack, showing how our actions trigger different security events.
So it's like rewinding the security camera footage, seeing how our simulated attacker moved through the network and what traces they left behind.
Exactly. We then need to correlate these events with our own logs, which show the specific TTPs we executed and the commands we ran. This allows us to see how the organization's defenses responded to each step of our attack.
So it's like comparing notes, seeing if their security tools picked up on the things we were doing.
Precisely. And if we find that certain TTPs went undetected, or that certain alerts were ignored or misinterpreted, that's a clear indication of a weakness in their defenses.
Okay, so we've reviewed the logs, correlated the events, and identified potential weaknesses. What's next? Do we just hand the organization a list of vulnerabilities and say, good luck fixing these?
Not quite. We need to go beyond simply identifying vulnerabilities. We need to provide actionable recommendations for improvement.
So it's not just about pointing out the flaws, it's about offering solutions, helping the organization build a stronger and more resilient security posture.
Exactly. And these recommendations should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. We need to tell the organization exactly what they need to do, how they can measure their progress, and when they need to complete the task.
This all sounds very practical and results-oriented. It's not just about theoretical security, it's about making a real difference in the organization's ability to defend against real-world threats.
Precisely. And the final step in the post-emulation analysis is to document our findings and present them to the organization in a clear and concise report.
Okay, so what are the key elements of a good adversary emulation report? What information should it include?
The report should start with an executive summary that provides a high-level overview of the engagement, the key findings, and the overall risk assessment. This should be written in plain language that's easy for non-technical stakeholders to understand.
So it's like the TLDR for the busy executives who need to understand the bottom line.
Exactly. Then we dive deeper into the technical details, outlining the specific TTPs we emulated, the security controls we tested, and the outcomes we observed.
So it's a combination of high-level insights and granular details.
Precisely. And for each weakness we identified, we provide specific recommendations for improvement. This could involve patching vulnerabilities, strengthening access controls, tuning detection rules, or even implementing new security technologies.
So it's not just about pointing out the flaws. It's about providing actionable guidance on how to fix them.
Absolutely. The goal of adversary emulation is to help organizations build a stronger and more resilient security posture. The report is a crucial tool for achieving that goal.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like we've really journeyed into the heart of adversary emulation and explored so many fascinating aspects, from the meticulous planning and strategic execution to the ethical considerations and the importance of continuous improvement.
I agree. It's been a great discussion, and I hope our listeners have gained a deeper appreciation for the power and potential of adversary emulation as a proactive cybersecurity strategy.
Absolutely. A big takeaway for me is that adversary emulation is not just about simulating attacks. It's about understanding the adversary's mindset, anticipating their moves, and building defenses that can withstand even the most sophisticated threats.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's about shifting from a reactive security posture to a proactive one where we're constantly testing, learning, and adapting to the ever-changing threat landscape.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of adversary emulation, and we encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe in the digital world.